All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to begin the last panel of the day. I know it's been a bit of a death march, but it's all been worth it, and we'll all have cocktails in our hands in an hour and a half or so. So hang in there. I wanted to make a couple of comments that I should have made earlier. One of our speakers, Patty Limerick, had to cancel yesterday due to some flight problems. And we had the editor of the New York Times Book Review for a long time, Pamela Paul, who was going to speak. About 2 weeks ago, I got a call from Pamela on my phone, picked it up, and she said, "Oh, I can't wait to get to Sioux Falls. I'm just getting on the plane in Chicago. This is going to be great." I'm like, "Well, the conference isn't for 2 weeks, Pamela." She's like, "Wait, what?" So she checked all the emails I had sent her, and I was, in fact, sending the correct date. So she was almost to Sioux Falls. And I said, "Well, get on the plane, fly out here, and we'll have a steak and call it good." But she got off the plane and went back to New York. So we told her we'll try and get her out here next year. I also wanted to thank Kaylee Lauk. I don't think she's in here. People keep asking me, "Is Kaylee your wife?" I'm like, "No, that's my cousin from Salem, South Dakota." And she just graduated from Notre Dame, and she's spending a year teaching out on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation at Porcupine School while she applies to go to graduate school in history. So she's soaking all this in and talking to people about where she should go for her history doctoral program. So please offer any advice or thoughts to her if you have some. Lastly, housekeeping item. For those of you who are speakers at the conference and are attending the dinner tonight for the speakers or are otherwise attending the dinner, we will proceed to Myrtles right after the conclusion of this panel. Myrtles is about 1 block to the north of here on Main Street. Myrtle's Fur Vault is the actual, there is a story behind it. In the old days when prominent people had furs, they wore furs in the winter, they would check them in at the vault during the summer months so that the moths wouldn't get them, and then go get them out of the vault in the fall. So, without further ado, let's start our last panel. Our first speaker is Jason Peters, who, with his wife of 40 years, lives in Ingham County, Michigan, where he currently lives 8 miles from where he was born and raised. He received his bachelor's degree from Calvin College in Michigan and his PhD from Michigan State University in English. He taught at Augustana College in the Quad Cities for 25 years before joining the faculty of Hillsdale College, and that was in 2021. Jason is the author of Wendell Berry, his life and work, and he's the co-editor of the book Localism in the Mass Age, a Front Porch Republic Manifesto. Front Porch Republic refers to a organization that promotes localism that he helped found. He's the editor of the organization's journal called Local Culture, and he has written extensively about Flannery O'Connor, T.S. Eliot, John Donne, Henry Adams, Walker Percy, and C.S. Lewis. So please welcome Jason.
I'm deeply disturbed that there hasn't been sufficient amount of laughter this afternoon. But it's nice to know that somebody from the New York Times apparently thinks it takes 2 weeks to get from New York to South Dakota. Zach mentioned having clicker anxiety. I don't have that problem. Power corrupts, and I'm quite certain that PowerPoint would corrupt me absolutely. So I won't be showing you any pictures. It's nice to come to the last panel. I like to be on the last panel. That means attention spans have already left the building. I could probably stand here and read a page from the phone book and nobody would notice. And I assure you that as soon as James gets up to talk, my attention span is going to head for the exits. It's all right, we abuse each other publicly. We've been doing it for many years. It's fine, it's okay. Until he does it. Last thing my wife said to me is, remember, you can't just say anything you want, which apparently I've forgotten already. I appreciated Susan's distinction earlier about a nostalgic historian, and as you fantasize now about happy hour, I'll just mention, apropos of nothing, Dorothy Parker's fine distinction. She said, I am not a writer with a drinking problem, I'm a drinker with a writing problem. And finally, thanks to John and what I guess we're now supposed to call the team. If I ever read a cover letter for a job applicant from a newly minted PhD who wants to join my team, I'll know that it's time for me to hang up my cleats. But thanks, John, it's been great. If you sometimes wonder, as I do, what the end of this enterprise is, then maybe sometimes you are by turns amused and despairing by King Solomon's grim assurance that it has no end. Solomon was reputed to be wise, notwithstanding all those wives and concubines. I mean, think of the number of mothers-in-law, for starters. But he wasn't talking about the telos of the making of books. He was talking about something else. And he certainly wasn't thinking about the American Midwest. So what is the telos? By the way, in starting that sentence with the word so, I'm not pretending to be an NPR radio host. In fact, we know full well what the end of this enterprise is. It's tenure and promotion. The proximate end might be the recovery and maybe even the defense of history and culture and art. An even less proximate end might be the education of undergraduates, which ought to be the most important thing we do. But to borrow from the Catechism, the chief end has been articulated without ambiguity by the contemporary university. Publications, grants, prestige, national and international reputation, tenure, promotion. I say this as someone who can see retirement on the horizon, riding at me at a full gallop like a hanging posse. But I wish to raise a question that it seems to me is not in the least bit irrelevant. What have university standards done for the health of the places we call home, or sometimes call home, because we academics are often itinerants? I thought it cynical more than 30 years ago when my thesis advisor, upon hearing that I got my first job, smiled wryly and said, well, you get your first job to get your second job, and you get your second job to get your third job. And I thought it was cynical when a medievalist I studied under said, you'll discover that the principal reward of this profession is going to conferences so you can drink with your real friends. And it was cynical until it turned out to be at least partly true. And it is a bit of a problem for me to stand here in front of you and admit that. But I want to ask this question and ask in a serious way. What have university standards done for the health of the places that we live in? If we could answer with the word nothing, there would be reason for hope, for that would mean the standards have not been damaging. But I think they have been damaging, and I don't think you need a team of social scientists to write a grant and conduct a study in order to demonstrate this. You need nothing more than a head with two eyes in it. The small town I live in, or I live outside of a few miles, has a very interesting history. Built initially on a river and sustained by timber and milling, it later welcomed a railroad that at first brought and then later failed to bring greater prosperity to the area. The main drag used to be a wood plank road. The town's train depot burned twice. The third iteration of the depot is nowhere near the tracks. Apparently that was considered bad luck. It was moved in the 1970s to a place far from the tracks and is currently maintained by the Chamber of Commerce so that the visitors, now numbering in the double digits, can be well accommodated whenever they go there. The history of the town has been written. The most extensive history of the town that's been written was written by a high school history teacher and coach, and it's not very extensive. It's a history that's out there waiting to be written. But you can imagine well enough, I think, school children in the lower grades sitting cross-legged and being told stories about the Chippewa tribe, the small Chippewa tribe that lived along that river for many years, the river that they see every day. It's easy, I think, to imagine that scene. It's harder to imagine students in the upper levels taking any interest whatsoever in their town, partly because neither they nor their teachers expect them to stay. Their teachers are fairly certain, and they themselves are fairly certain that they'll be out of there pretty soon and probably not coming back. And it's too bad, because maybe the telling of that history, maybe the sharing of that story would do something about the outward migration of the young people there. But it's a very interesting place, and it lives between, the town resides between two major research universities. To the west, Michigan State, the nation's first among many land-grant universities, none of which, near as I can tell, honor the legislation that brought them into being, which is to be faithful custodians of rural places and rural people and the agriculture that supports them. And to the east, the University of Michigan, or as we like to call them, those cheating bastards. And they cheated their way to victory over Northwestern today, I see. There's material aplenty in my hometown and my township and my county for historians to work on. There's material aplenty for writers to make use of. I myself could be the inspiration for the protagonist of a novel that every judge of the National Book Circles Award would be riveted by. One bit of lore from my county that I take particular interest in is that my wife's great-great-grandfather once invited a local Indian chief who gave his name to a neighboring town. James grew up right next to this town. Coclanis is the name of the town. Her great-great-grandfather invited this Indian chief into his house one winter night to warm him up and give him something to eat. And the rumor is that Chief Coclanis brought rattlesnake for the evening repast. And this is a story that lives on in the memories of my wife and her sister and their cousins, and in the memory of my father-in-law, but sometimes he doesn't remember what he asked you 5 minutes ago. And I think there's those of us who know stories like this have some responsibility to pass them on, to make them part of local knowledge. I may have more to say about that. We'll see how the time goes. Probably not. But I want to insist that such knowledge must exist in the memories of living people, and that we academics could do a better job of seeing the value not only of written records, but of living memory. I have no objection to the memory being present in books. I think it should be preserved in books. But I am suggesting that if we are to live by standards that are higher and more demanding than those of the university, standards by which dying communities might be preserved instead of strip mined for their talent until they are barren and dead, such stories must remain alive on people's tongues, just as Joe Amato said. But it can't remain alive if people do not stay put. It can't remain alive if we continue uncritically to approve of hypermobility. Now, I mentioned that I could be the model for a protagonist of a novel. I hope you realize I mean that ironically, but there's a story that should be true, if it isn't, about a judge for one of the big book awards, maybe the Pulitzer, but probably the National Book Critics Circle Award, who, upon hearing that Marilynne Robinson's novel Gilead had been nominated, parted with a predictable sneer. Why would I want to read about a preacher from Iowa? Gilead, by the way, won both of those awards. And then there's a story that should not be true, but is, about the political philosopher Robert De Niro, who was complaining on a mainstream news outlet about people somewhere way out in the Midwest, in certain places, rural places, that's a quotation, who don't hear the truth about the current occupant of the Oval Office. This is not a partisan remark. There are two major political parties in the country, and I am conveniently equipped with two middle fingers. That is not a coincidence, as far as I'm concerned. Dr. De Niro, who, like all actors who spent his life pretending, believes the news outlets like the one in this instance was whoring with him can do a better job of controlling the total nonsense that those people out there listen to. That's also a quotation. And then there's the story of the woman from Georgia who went to the University of Iowa. She thought she would be a cartoonist. She had a talent for it. She heard about the writer's workshop. She sued for entry into it. She got entry into it. She graduated from it. According to the script, she went from Iowa to New York City. And then in an act of career suicide, she decided to go back home to Georgia, where she wrote a number of highly wrought stories, two very fine novels, a very good book of lectures, a trove of letters that are a curriculum in themselves, before dying at the age of 39. I'm describing the life of Flannery O'Connor, who said that she never would have become the writer that she became had she not gone back home. In other words, that act of writer's suicide was exactly the right thing. Anecdotes like these abound, and they speak to a proper kind of chauvinism, the love of place and region, places and regions and sections worthy not only of our scholarly attention, but also of our arts and sciences. A biologist I know once told me that men and women in his discipline could remain in their own backyards and never exhaust the possibilities of research. The great Edward Abbey, in a typical Edward Abbey moment, said of Moab, Utah, "This is the most beautiful place on earth. There are thousands of such places." He meant that everywhere we are is lovely. We might have to qualify that, however, if there is an Applebee's sprouting up across the street. And yet here we are trying to defend all this. My topic and my title is the regional motive and responsibility to place. I don't approach it as a historian because I'm not one. I don't approach it as a literary theorist because then I'd have to swallow cyanide. But I approve of regional motives and responsibility to place. I just feel obliged to be a little bit suspicious of them if the temptation arises to professionalize them. I don't like careerism. I don't like to live in a career, mainly because I don't want to be found dead in one. I know that we are all subjects to established academic standards, but I think those standards have, by and large, been harmful to the places that we call home. Solomon, to go back to where I started, said, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." I'll skip the fearing God part while still attempting to address the conclusion of the whole matter. My view is that although professional work is very important, local memory and local associations are more important and more immediately to be cultivated. Please bear in mind the question I asked at the start about the health of the places that we live in. Obviously, if the health of the places we live in is no concern of ours, then I'm wrong about prioritizing local memory and associations. Certainly, we should continue to produce scholarship, particularly the kind that unites us here today. But living memory alive in those walking around, will have a more immediate and salutary effect on the health and wholeness of a place than a whole shelf of books will. And for this reason, I would have the students in a given place instructed in the lore of that place. And I would introduce them to the word land. I assume that the land is made fit for human habitation by old association and memory. But I also assume, and this is the more important point, that by memory and old association, we are made fit to inhabit the land. And land here is not the place like where you're standing in front of the Chuck E. Cheese's and looking across the 7-lane road to the Target on the other side, which you can't see because of the curvature of the earth. It's more and more difficult, really, to think of the places that we come, to speak of the places that we come from as land. But I think we are, in fact, made fit to inhabit the land by memory and by old association. And those are the 2 points that I wish to emphasize this afternoon in this talk about regional motive and responsibility to place. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.
Our next speaker is James Matthew Wilson, who is the Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature and the founding director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. James is the author of 16 books, the most recent of which is a book of poems titled St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, published in 2024. James also serves as poet in residence of the Benedict Institute, scholar in residence at Aquinas College in Michigan, editor of Coliseum Books, and the poetry editor of the journal Modern Age. Born and raised in East Lansing, Michigan, and educated at the University of Michigan and the University of Notre Dame, he now makes his home in Michigan, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he returned after many years of living in Philadelphia, and he wrote an essay, an essay very much worth reading about returning to Michigan, about returning home, and how important that was to him. Please welcome James.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jason, for warming up the crowd. Much appreciated. Thanks to you all the speakers, for your discussion today. It's very interesting as an interloping poet to sit in an audience all day listening to historians and geographers, the when and where people, talking about the structure of your field and this in this particular area of inquiry. I thought it was especially edifying to reflect on the discussions that took place about love of the Midwest, nostalgia for the Midwest, in the context of the scholarship on the Midwest. It reminds me that that historians maybe have not entirely escaped the conundrum that Herodotus set for you all 2,500 years ago, when he declared that his purpose in writing the histories was to uncover the truth of things, but also to give glory and give due glory to things, to love and give glory and to inquire into and discover the truth are not always the same thing, but they can be, and in the best circumstances, they are the same thing. I want to build a bit of a mousetrap for myself and then extricate myself from it, kind of on the model of this inquiry versus glory question. And my subject is on the reviving of a case for the reviving of literary regionalism. And I approach the subject with apprehensions that as a poet, I have to have in a way that perhaps the historian of the Midwest or a regional historian would not have to have some sort of trepidation. So here's what I mean by that. If you were to look at the pages or the table of contents of David Perkins' superb History of Modern Poetry in 2 volumes, published in the 70s and 80s of the last century, you would see that the major chapters around which the collection is, or the volumes are organized, are chapters on the great high modernist poets. W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, and to a lesser extent, William Carlos Williams, and a few others. Each of these figures were known in their day and are remembered now, not so much for what they spoke of, but for the radical formal innovations in which they engaged. So Perkins' literary history is primarily organized around aesthetic form rather than around a particular subject matter. He does, however, in one place, at least, it may be, in fact, only this one place, make some room for talking about subject matter as an organizing principle. Namely, there's a short chapter called Conservative and Regional Poets of America in the first volume of the history. Now, there are literary figures that we would expect to hear of under that heading, such as Robert Frost and Carl Sandburg. Those poets are significant enough that they're given their own separate chapters, or at least sections of other chapters in the volume. But what Perkins means by conservative and regional poets is specifically those poets who chose the geographical region and its culture for their subject matter and had their careers defined by that. I'm just going to read a short passage from the beginning of this chapter. Perkins writes, "Regional poetry has been written in America with diverse motives. Among them are local piety and patriotism, fascination with the history, ways of life, types of character, folklore, and speech of a geographical section. The wish to exploit in poetry a relatively unfamiliar subject matter and idiom, and sometimes a more commercial wish to cash in on popular nostalgia for the days of dory fishing, or stove wood splitting, or sod breaking, or bronco busting, or turkey in the straw. If anybody can tell me what turkey in the straw is, please see me after the panel. Dory fishing I could use help with too, probably." So he highlights the difference, say, between Robert Frost, for whom the subject matter of his poetry seemed so important, because the New England character was distinct and something worth studying for its own sake, and someone like William Carlos Williams, who certainly is known for his explorations of Paterson, New Jersey, his hometown, but who chose that subject matter chiefly because he thought it was exemplary of America as a whole, as opposed to being distinguished as part of a region within the country. This broad distinction I'm drawing between a look at literature in terms of its formal qualities or looking at literature in terms of its subject matter elements, its matter, its material, is an ancient one. If we look back to Plato's Republic, for instance, where Plato's most widely known discussion of poetry takes place, Plato addresses mythos, or speaks of poetry almost entirely in terms of mythos. That is to say, Plato's concern with poetry in the Republic is almost entirely absorbed by the kinds of stories the poets tell, and whether those stories are edifying or not. In Plato's other longest dialogue, the Laws, written closer to the end of his career, however, Plato speaks of poetry almost entirely in terms of its form, its musical properties, melody and rhythm, as he puts it in the Symposium, or metron, meter. We see something like that in Aristotle's Poetics as well. In the Poetics, for those of you who haven't read it in a few weeks, he begins by saying, when people inquire into the nature of poetry, they usually begin by listing off the different meters and assuming that defines the poem, the elegy and elegiac meter, the iambic and iambic meter, so on and so forth. Even when they say epic poetry, they mean primarily the hexameter rather than its subject matter. But, says Aristotle, this only takes us so far. And so the remainder of his inquiry in the Poetics is to try to capture those particular qualities of tragedy and epic that set them apart from the other kinds of poetry. And many people have, I think incorrectly, interpreted Aristotle as more or less saying, form will get you nowhere. You have to talk about the guts. You have to talk about the stuff, the substance of the storytelling content of a poem in order to understand it. So this distinction between form and subject matter is an ancient one, but it's really not until, when was 1795 mentioned earlier today? Was it with the Northwest Ordinance? I'm forgetting now. In one of the earlier presentations, 1795 came up, and I thought, I'm so glad that year came up, because in 1795, something extraordinary happened in the history of the arts and literature in particular, and that is that the German poets, playwrights, and amateur philosopher, I mean, all philosophers are amateurs, but he was even more amateur than most of them, Friedrich Schiller published two important books. The first one is called On the Aesthetic Education of Man. It's a book where he argues that the fine arts are that particular kind of artifact where matter, material, is endowed with and dominated by form. And by form, he means the stuff of the spirit that the rational and moral intellect of man shapes. And that the arts are essential to the cultivation of human beings because human beings are born mere sensuous babies. You were hardly thinking about things when you were a baby. You were just eating and drinking and sleeping and filling diapers, etc. But we slowly emerge out of this sensuous life, this pure sensuous impulse, as he puts it, and begin to acquire an impulse for form. In the work of art, says Schiller, or maybe I should put it this way, the work of art, says Schiller, is the midwife that draws us from the life of the senses towards the life of the intellect. And the reason that the work of art can do this is because it is matter, so it appeals to the senses, but it's dominated by the stuff of form. It's dominated by the stuff of the intellect and morality. And so following his master Kant, Schiller tells us that when we encounter a work of fine arts, our otherwise somnolent impulse for form awakens by way of the senses, and we experience for the first time the freedom of play and contemplation, where we recognize that we too are form, by which he means we too are spirit. If I seem to be using terms very loosely here, that's not my fault, that's Schiller's fault. That's just how he worked. This, in turn, says Schiller, will prepare human beings, this experience of art, to assume both the life of reason and logic and also of moral responsibility. And this was the missing step in modern culture, the aesthetic education that would be necessary if the great masses of human beings were to use the freedoms they won by things like the French Revolution for anything other than anarchy. The same year, Schiller wrote another book called On Naive and Sentimental Poetry, where he looks at the arts not in terms of its formal properties, but in terms of its subject matter. Some poets approach subject matter in a naive fashion. Goethe is his great master there, and some in a sentimental fashion. You may think sentimental means mawkish, but what he really means is in an estranged and ironic fashion, reflective fashion. So we have from Schiller two great accounts of the arts, one that's focused entirely on the formal properties, and another that's focused on the content or the subject matter of the arts. These treatises will be incredibly influential, but their influence will trickle out over the course of more than a century. It's only in the 20th century that Schiller's concept of art as essentially form dominating matter comes to the fore, and it begets what we call literary modernism. If you wonder why, for instance, that Rothko canvas is just a bunch of blots of red paint, it's because it's pure form, baby. There's no content. And that's the sort of fulfillment of Schiller's dream of art becoming just pure formality, dominating, in that case, the material of paint. But in the 19th century, Schiller's other account of literature is much more influential. And that leads to the 19th century becoming the great age of literary nationalism, where the national literatures, as it were, become conscious of themselves, and the French, first the German, then the French, and then the English, begin thinking of the works of literature that have been produced in their languages as specifically national expressions. We see an early example of this in Jane Austen, when she mentions in passing, I forget where, how every Englishman has a natural love of Shakespeare. You just can't help it. One of the A late instance of this would be the rise of national literature in Ireland. And I want to reflect on that for just a moment as a kind of cautionary tale. In the early 20th century, in the early days of the Irish Free State, the short story writer, poet, and literary critic Daniel Corkery began to agitate strongly for an Irish national literature. His most famous expression of this comes in a book called Sing in Anglo-Irish Literature. What's conspicuous about his account of literature there is that it's entirely subject matter defined. He says, Irish literature is that literature that deals with the land, and then in a rather pleonastic fashion, Irish nationalism, and religion as the culture of the people. In the course of prosecuting this argument, Corkery excludes from Irish literature many of the major writers of Ireland in his day. James Joyce, Thomas McGreevy, I think Yeats gets a pass. This is not, in my view, a terribly helpful way of approaching literature. To define something as belonging to a literature merely because of its subject matter rather than because of its form tends to create lines of exclusion that are not terribly helpful in understanding what makes literature literature. This is the risk we run when we talk about a regional literature. Are we being what Etienne Gilson would call Philistines, who are attending only to the matter being discussed, the subject matter, rather than thinking about this liberating experience of aesthetic form that Schiller had described 100 years earlier? Well, one of Corkery's victims in this account is Thomas McGreevy, an Irish poet, an art historian. Do I really only have 16 seconds left? Oh, wait, I'm over. How'd that happen? Okay, well, I'll bring it to a conclusion here. Thomas McGreevy, this is actually just where I was hoping to end, but I didn't think I was going to get there, and I guess I didn't. Okay, so, but so as not to leave you hanging, I'll just say this very briefly. So Thomas McGreevy was an Irish poet. He was a critic and an art historian. He was also a veteran of the First World War, fighting in the British Army. And McGreevy agreed with Corkery that in some sense, every literature expressed the nation. But he insisted that what was expressed was the permanent aspect of the nation, which he categorizes under the classical trinity of transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that every literature, therefore, incarnates or gives concrete expression to these everlasting forms. And this strikes me as an especially fruitful way to think about regional literature. That what we are doing is not simply fetishizing or making a nationalist project out of looking at the arts and crafts of a region, but rather we're appreciating the way in which these particular localized modes of expression give voice to the universal and deepen our common humanity. So on that note, not a moment too soon, I will end.
Our next speaker is Peter Coclanis, who is the Albert Newsome Distinguished Professor of History and Director of the Global Research Institute at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He earned his BA at Drake University in Des Moines and his MA and PhD at Columbia. Peter's latest book, co-edited with Arne Kalleberg, is titled Challenging Capitalism, Paths Taken, Roads Ahead, and will be published very soon by Routledge. Coclanis grew up in a blue-collar union family in Chicago, in an area 3 miles north and 2 miles west of the Loop, the downtown area. Later in their lives, Peter's parents moved to an 80-acre farm in Greene County in south central Wisconsin, deepening his Midwestern roots even further. Peter also is the author of an amazing essay that ran in Middle West Review about the history of Big Ten football that I urge you to read. Peter.
Thank you very much for sticking around this long. I have a spot on the much coveted 7th session here, and I'm pleased to be with you today. My session I was supposed to be on the first session with Patty Limerick, and John gave me my marching orders as well, and that was to talk kind of narrowly about strategies and tactics for revitalizing Midwestern history. So some of what I said has already been, some of what I wish to say has already been said at a number of other sessions, so pretend that this is the first session as I go on. Now, I'm an economic historian, which economic history is a small field, and some of you have probably never even encountered an economic historian. Someone once defined an economic historian as someone who likes numbers but lacked sufficient charm, grace, or wit to make it as an accountant. And I think that kind of captures me in some ways. So let me start, as many of you have already, by thanking the irrepressible and indefatigable John Lauck for all his work on this conference, the overarching task of which is to find ways to reinvigorate Midwestern history. This seems a formidable task for anyone, even for the accomplished specialists gathered here today, but it seems especially tough for me, though I am not a specialist, because I am not a specialist on the Midwest. I am, as John said, a native Midwesterner, and over the years have written a bit on the region's history, but most of my scholarly work has been on the history of other regions, particularly the American South and Southeast Asia. Given this fact, my best option, I think, is to proceed via a form of intellectual arbitrage, seeking value from assets undervalued in the Midwestern market, as it were. That is to say, insights, ideas, and conceptualizations drawn from my work on other regions that may have some relevance for the Midwest and its history. First, a few words on the rationale for trying to revitalize Midwestern history in the first place. I have a short amount of time, so I can't really get into trying to define the Midwest precisely as a region or its subregions, much less to split hairs. With regard to a definition of the Midwest, I'm tempted to invoke the great jazz trumpeter Louis Armstrong, who, when asked about the definition of jazz, famously responded, "If you gotta ask, you'll never know." Now, rather than quibble about matters of definition then, let me dive right into a quick justification for revitalization of the Midwest, however defined. The first point of emphasis in this regard relates to the Midwest's influence in American history in every conceivable way: economic, demographic, political, social, cultural, historical, even moral. Had I time, I'm confident I can make convincing cases for the Midwest's importance in each of these realms. Secondly, I'd point to the region's great legacy assets, which, as we shall see, continue to be great assets today and will be going forward. Drawing from the work of Chicago journalist and Iowa native Richard Longworth, let me start with 3 such assets. A plethora of fresh water. The Great Lakes alone comprise 20% of the world's surface freshwater. A large labor force with advanced skills, a legacy of the region's unparalleled agro-industrial experience. Thirdly, a great tertiary educational system, particularly research universities. To Longworth's list, I would add another great asset, the abundance of fertile land, arguably the best in the world. I would also emphasize the Midwest's central position or location in America, literally and figuratively. Here one can appeal for inspiration to Aristotle's ethics, the politics, etc., on the golden mean, the middle, the importance of balance, the resistance to extremes, etc., or more modestly to Waylon Jennings, who once wrote in a song, "From sea to shining sea and coast to coast, somewhere in the middle is the land I love the most. I ain't California pretty, I can't survive the Great White Way, I'm too dumb for New York City and too ugly for LA." Hardly Aristotle, but straight from the heartland. On to matters of strategy. The motto of the state where I live today, North Carolina, is esse quam videri, to be rather than to seem. Okay, but in my view, it would be good for North Carolina's being to be seen as well. With this in mind, my strategic advice for revitalizing Midwestern history begins with rebranding by clarifying the region's image, promoting and amplifying this image until it sticks. In Latin, the new motto would boil down to something like videre clare, to be seen clearly. Instead of the conventional images and tropes employed in characterizing the region, the Rust Belt, flyover country, Jesus land, etc., and tired nods in the direction of Marx's misinterpreted phrase in the manifesto about the idiocy of rural life in talking about the Midwest, which is to say implying that the region is populated by bland, insular, backward people who may be Midwestern nice but are nonetheless boring. I view the region rather more as the heartland, the central core, the center of America, the region most representative of America's values, people, and history, an area well positioned to make its future, particularly in a time of climate change. Clearly, no other area is so deeply implicated in such central ways in so many American plots: agriculture, industry, transportation, migration, immigration, urbanization, rural-urban connections, regional development. With apologies to Walt Whitman, it can be said that the Midwest, however defined, is large and contains multitudes of experiences and meanings that deserve close scrutiny and, as importantly, valorization and respect. No flyover country, the Midwest, for if you want to understand America, there is only one way there, and that is through the Midwest. And both my strategic and tactical positions grow out of this assumption. My overall strategic recommendation, then, is to try as much as possible to shift the narrative, and in so doing, to get more people interested in this incredibly rich and interesting area, and to do so with confidence, even boldness. With regard to tactics, a couple of things should always be kept in mind. First, you can't be everything everywhere all at once. This being the case, two economic concepts can discipline our thinking. One, there are opportunity costs associated with every action taken. That is to say, the value of the best opportunity foregone because of a particular action. And two, we must always think in terms of our comparative advantage or advantages tactically, that which you can do more efficiently than another entity. Once a comparative advantage is identified, think of the best ways to leverage it. With these principles in mind, let me, in the time remaining, lay out a few specific tactical paths to consider in shifting the narrative, and in so doing, raising the profile of the Midwest and its history. For starters, if Midwestern history can't be everything everywhere all at once, it needs to be more visible in more places more often. How so? For starters, in addition to presenting our work at our own professional meeting, the Midwestern History Association, we should be organizing sessions on Midwestern history or sessions with Midwestern historical inflections at professional meetings of as many other scholarly societies and associations as we can: historical, sociological, economic, literary, whatever. There's plenty of associations out there that we should be more visible in. We need to become a more consistent, expected, and visible presence in associational life in the United States across the board. Similarly, we should establish a distinguished speakers roster of scholars, something like the OAH has established, with people who will lecture gratis, expenses only, to any and all audiences interested or potentially interested in aspects of Midwestern history. These audiences could be colleges and universities, K-12 groups, Rotary clubs, the American Legion, senior citizen living communities, whatever. In this regard, we should also promote and publicize the availability of relevant speakers to college and university board meetings, to business and labor conventions, political conventions, et cetera, et cetera. We should also commit ourselves to partnering with other scholarly associations on important and stimulating research topics which offer a value add to each. One can envision, for example, partnering with the Southern Historical Association, a group with which I have long been involved, on, say, a standalone scholarly program on the Great Migration, maybe with a meeting one year in Mississippi and the next year in Chicago, or a co-sponsored session at the annual meetings of the SHA and the MHA. Another possibility might be co-sponsored projects or conference sessions with the Western History Association on Midwestern migration to California and other parts west. There are other possibilities out there as well. A number of years ago, I wrote a piece for AHA Perspectives on History in which I played off of the STEM craze to make a case for adding history, or at least historical perspectives, to the mix. Artsy types had beat me to the punch, of course, and they had already offered the acronym STEAM in order to add arts to science, technology, engineering, and math. I couldn't come up with a catchy add-on to STEAM, so in the piece I tried another configurations. I called it themas: technology, history, engineering, math, arts, and science. Not only does historical context and learning to think historically, thinking in time, as May and Newstead famously put it, add valuable context to STEM, but let's face it, in a practical sense, STEM is where the academy is these days. If you don't believe me, think a little bit about what happened to history at Iowa State, among other places. This action item here is to reach out to STEMers on campus, all of us. And while at it, we should reach out to, as well to our schools of business and schools of agriculture too. Try to develop courses with Midwestern content that would appeal to STEMers. Regarding the history value add, don't you think Midwestern STEM personnel, whether it's deans, directors, professors, students alike, would be interested in how and why the region built the most impressive agro-industrial complex the world has ever known? How and why technological innovations ranging from mechanical equipment to hybrid corn were adopted and diffused so quickly on Midwestern farms? And here we could even appeal to steamers, to wit. In the mid-19th century, the same period in which Millet and other French painters of the so-called Barbizon school were capturing the rudimentary, even retrograde nature of French agriculture and rural life in their works, particularly the lack of mechanization, the Midwest was well into mechanization, led by innovators such as McCormick, Deere, Case, etc., and the Midwest tractorization in the early 20th century came a half century ahead of the process in France. And while on agriculture, wouldn't STEMers find it interesting and valuable to learn that farm clearing was the largest source of capital formation in the United States in the whole of the 19th century? Back to industry. Both STEMers and business school types would benefit from learning that during the so-called Second Industrial Revolution, basically 1870 to 1914, Midwestern cities, places like Cleveland and Detroit, were the great technological and organizational innovators, with the region's cities constituting the Silicon Valley of their day. There are some valuable lessons here, and strong cases can be made that Midwestern historical content should be made available in STEM, ag schools, and business schools in the region, with people such as us, people in this room, prepared to provide that content. Then, of course, we come to public-facing activities, as some of these Kevin Mason has already talked about, where we can all do more to make Midwestern history more visible and user-friendly to broad audiences. Here I'm thinking of op-ed pieces on historical topics, whether we're thinking of Midwest-specific pieces akin to Patricia Limerick's popular columns a while back in USA Today, podcasts, social media posts, and don't hold your nose. Here I would add creating and disseminating listicles of one type or another, issued regularly in open source, available to any and all publication outlets. In this regard, I'm thinking of fun, debatable, and still thought-provoking and valuable categories such as top 10 Midwestern authors, top 10 baseball, football, basketball players from the Midwest, and other top 10s, inventors, business or labor leaders, political leaders, singers, rock groups, movie and TV shows set in the Midwest, criminals, whatever. The possibilities are endless. A bit gimmicky to be sure, but clickbait such as listicles can spur interest in the region and its history, especially among the young. Honey rather than vinegar and all that. And if successful, they might lead to dormitory debates or barroom disputes, in so doing, helping the Midwest to register a bit more prominently in popular culture and in the popular imagination. It is my hope and expectation that smart, talented, and passionate people, such as those assembled here, will, in addition to their indispensable scholarly work, take the bit and pursue one or more of the tactics mentioned above, and in so doing, revivify Midwestern history, because we have an important, indeed compelling story to tell, a story at the heart of American history more generally. Now let me close on a note at once hopeful and revealing, suggested by some recent developments in Chicago, my hometown. In 1882, during the Second Industrial Revolution, a steel mill opened near the confluence of the Calumet River and Lake Michigan on the far southeast side of Chicago. As a result of a mega merger in 1901, the plant was incorporated into what later became U.S. Steel, then the largest company in the world. The plant grew and at its height extended over 500 acres of land and employed about 20,000 workers. Like much of the legacy U.S. steel industry, it declined over the last third of the 20th century and closed its doors after 110 years in 1992. Once closed, the carcass of the mill became a decaying eyesore, and the increasingly impoverished area around it became an environmental disaster area, full of slag, heavy metals, and polluted waterways. It remained that way for 30 years, despite a number of stillborn efforts to redevelop the vast deindustrial wasteland. Just recently, however, the area has again been in the news. A redevelopment plan has finally gotten off the ground, a plan developed by the city and state, working with developers, the private sector, and community groups over the last 9 years. The idea was super ambitious, to build on the former site of South Works something called the Illinois Quantum and Microelectronics Park, focusing on quantum computing, a risky focus, but one with considerable upside potential. The first company on the campus, Silicon Valley-based PsiQuantum, broke ground in September, just about a month and a half ago. Other entities associated with the campus include NVIDIA, IBM, DARPA, the French company Pascal, BlackRock, Singapore's Temasek Holdings, the Qatar Investment Authority, and others. Although very different from U.S. Steel, PsiQuantum's pages are stuck together. PsiQuantum is counting on the Midwest's three great historical strengths and continued comparative advantages: water, a workforce blessed with skills developed and tempered over time via the rigors of the region's agro-industrial heritage, and the area's great universities. In some ways, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. In other ways, an exciting departure from, or better yet, extension of the Midwest's storied past. Let me leave you with the descriptors heartland and core for the Midwest rather than flyover area or Rust Belt, and by pointing out in any case that scientists have long known that rust, iron oxide, has many, many important and beneficial uses in agriculture, manufacturing, medicine, some of which we are just beginning to understand. Thank you.
Our last speaker of the day is Sara Egge. She is the Claude Pottinger Professor of History at Centre College in Kentucky. She received her PhD from Iowa State University and as an undergrad went to NDSU in Fargo. Her book, Woman, Suffrage, and Citizenship in the Midwest, won several prizes. And I remember reviewing it for one of the Midwestern history journals. It's a great book. She is currently writing a book on the history of naturalization in the United States. She's a past president of the Midwestern History Association, and most importantly, she is a native of Yankton, South Dakota. So welcome a great Sodakian, Sara Egge.
All right, you made it till almost the end. So I'm taking a page from what Peter just talked about, that we need to shift the narrative And if there is any hope in the future, which I think there is a lot, it is to challenge ourselves in ways that we can approach this narrative. So I'm going to offer a suggested approach that we can hopefully continue to discuss. The field of Midwestern history is alive. So here's the approach. I think that community defined the Midwest. The ways in which people understood and delineated its bounds, both real and imagined, the ways they forged its institutions, set parameters of inclusion and exclusion, and crafted identities out of belonging to certain communities, activated the Midwest as an idea arranged in a particular geographic area. The region was neither frontier, middle ground, nor borderland. The Midwest existed as and continues to be a place without edges, an arena that functioned as both destination and transition. Likewise, the people who have built Midwestern community then fostered identities that defied easy categorizations. There never has been a typical Midwesterner. Encounters with community conceptualized and experienced as place, people, and project animated the notion that this vast interior had enough coherence to claim regionality. Framing the Midwest by using community as an idea generated across time periods and within a bounded place, one that shifted as people contested, reviewed, and reimagined those boundaries and those it contained, brings precision to ambiguous claims and uncovers novel insights about the Midwest as a product of specific geographic and temporal contexts. The Midwest was never lost. What the region's history lacks is not attention. Scholars have studied its urban hubs and rural heartlands since people began to characterize the nation's interior as a distinct middle place. Midwestern history has suffered because region making itself was a contested process, as we've heard, carried out during the late 19th and early 20th centuries by regional boosters, academics, observers, and artists who judged Midwestern significance through specific identities. Historians have often relied upon these accounts to portray the Midwest, quotes, as the cradle of democracy and capitalistic growth, where people with shared ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds embraced an enlightened vision of individual liberty and progress. But a limited focus only privileges an elite perspective at the expense of the countless other voices. This also tells a one-dimensional narrative, so let's shift the narrative. Relying on a framework that takes seriously the lens of community as concept and place helps to uncover the silences. It reveals a region that for centuries has existed through the lives of people in transition, in between, in motion. I have to just say the title of the latest volume by John, Between Loving and Leaving, is transitional, and I think that's a really important point to raise and consider. These individuals crafted not a singular identity, but ones that deviated from norms and disrupted hierarchies radically and frequently. In this way, assessing the Midwest as a never-ending, relentless process of community making offers an important approach that accounts for a history of the Midwest, one where we can all participate, I hope. Its narrative emerges at the confluence of placemaking that considers community as both a specific geographic place and an ever-moving conceptual target. And it embraces the link between contradiction and acceptance, which I also wrote in parentheses, this is also stubborn, but with a lot of tenacity. And I think this is where we can locate the site of democracy itself. Scholarship activating this framework is abundant, and it continues to make Midwestern history the most compelling field of study. Much of it produced in the last decade examines the Midwest as an imagined place, as a process often marked in a transition toward or shifting in some way between identities or categories. Donna Doan Anderson's article entitled Acceptance for Admission, Administrations of Japanese American Relocation and the Midwestern University framed the Midwest as a region designated for its geographic interiority and metaphorical insularity, with shifting politics often shaped by the coast to absorb and counter racial differences. She borrows from Kristen Hoganson's book, The Heartland in American History, which asserted that the Heartland myth cultivated the region as an arena imagined to maintain Euro-American national mythology. Anderson also weaves the theoretical work of Richard Slotkin and Tina Chen to imagine the Midwestern space as both mythic, full of symbols, signals, and styles, and geographic, rooted in specific communities and contexts. A chorus of scholars sing a similar refrain. Corey Law explains how progressive activists animated the Democratic Party in the upper Midwest, reviving farm labor, rural urban, and working class solidarity, and reimagining the Midwest as a non-red political bulwark. Emiliano Aguilar contends that Latinx people, such as the families who found work in steel mills in cities like Gary and East Chicago, Indiana, reimagined their communities through a commitment to generational economic advancement and cultural expression, engaging in placemaking with the same conviction as all other Midwesterners. Jasmine Sutton and Kalani Craig explore how the silence in Midwestern archives about Black women's lives shaped their research methods to pursue descendant archival practices to create digital archives about rural Black Midwestern women. Her work reconstructing primary sources is powerful because it challenges historians of the Midwest to consider how archival absences have created scholarly gaps and repositions people of color at the cradle of Midwestern community making. Ashley Howard also takes up Black Midwestern history in her work entitled Midwest Unrest, 1960s Urban Rebellions and the Black Freedom Movement, showcasing how urban uprising were specific political tools used to disrupt the systems of racialized oppression against working class Black Midwesterners. By diving into arrest records, oral history interviews, and other government reports, Howard reveals that the Midwest was full of radicals determined to fight for equality in communities like Omaha, Cincinnati, and Milwaukee. The scholars named here are only a few of the many whose work illuminates a Midwest in which people worked across Midwestern communities to contradict, challenge, and recast the region and themselves. Exploring women's suffrage in the Midwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries led me to realize that activists in the region deliberately crafted an identity that Midwestern citizenship meant active civic participation, civic virtue. When they demanded the ballot, they claimed that it was part of an established pattern of civic engagement that all Midwesterners cherished. They reimagined suffrage not as a radical movement of deviant outsiders, but as thoroughly Midwestern, born of and activated by women whose civic work on behalf of churches, libraries, schools, and other community institutions had venerated them as protectors of democracy and therefore deserving of the ballot. Placing women's suffrage in Midwestern communities challenged broader, more conventional narratives of the cause, which benefited the field of women's suffrage by producing a richer, more complex understanding of women's suffrage. But the study also exposed how migration and upheaval had reified racial, ethnic, and religious identities to create distinct Midwestern communities with political inclinations bound not by party, but by who its residents were. Just as other scholars have discovered, envisioning this history required me to take stock of Midwestern communities as both an idea and a place, one made and unmade as people reassessed boundaries and shifted identities, and to capture precisely the specific places and people who led the movement. And a hat tip to Dorothy Schweeder, who met with me when I was working on my dissertation and said, you should study suffrage in local communities. And I chose 3 counties and 3 different states. And now I have this book. So on one of these boundaries were non-citizens, the boundaries of community, who had arrived in the region as outsiders, but who had participated in placemaking as enthusiastically as their native-born neighbors. But when they sought to retain their ethnic and religious identities in defiance to pressure to assimilate, not only did they frustrate native-born Midwesterners, but they also became a foil for suffragists, because they could vote before becoming naturalized citizens. They voted as non-naturalized people who had declared their intent to become citizens eventually, and their presence in the electoral body contrasted directly with the absence of native-born women who could not vote despite their birthright. This is called declarant suffrage, and it's so fascinating. Midwestern suffragists stewed for decades, frustrated that their robust civic engagement ended at the ballot box. But World War I amplified a broad but targeted anti-immigrant sentiment in the region. Suffrage efforts that had languished for decades found purchase after 1917, and bills that had stalled in state legislatures in South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and other Midwestern states received enthusiastic support from politicians who were previously lukewarm at best to the cause. These bills added additional clauses, ones that ended non-citizen voting, declarant suffrage. And what that said in the Midwest in that moment was that patriots who supported the war effort had to demonstrate their loyalty, and what better way than by enfranchising civically active native-born women while stripping the ballot from traitorous immigrants whose espionage against World War I could include electoral sabotage. And they said this in 1916 in South Dakota, and I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. So studying women's suffrage underscored the significance of community as I've discussed it, emphasizing the ways in which community as both concept and place splintered and reconstituted itself around a controversial political issue. It has continued to animate my thinking, and my ongoing work seeks to uncover the contradictions embedded in communities in the region. For example, examining Midwestern masculinity reveals that many communities championed figures who demonstrated individuality, shrewdness, and discipline, while also simultaneously celebrating anti-capitalist and anti-elite radicals for supporting farmers, laborers, and other underdogs. The same region that prized railroad tycoon James J. Hill, oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, car manufacturer Henry Ford, and milling mogul Charles Pillsbury also nurtured anarchist Albert Parsons, who helped organize the 1886 Haymarket Square protest in Chicago, Eugene Debs, a powerfully influential socialist, labor activist, and presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, an antagonistic populist and political force for over 3 decades, and Gus Hall, born Arvo Kusta Hallberg, the last chair of the Communist Party in the United States. While such divergence in a region as vast and as varied in the Midwest was unsurprising, it was the proximity of these conflicting visions that was striking. Midwesterners often expressed admiration for men like Rockefeller, Parsons, and Bryan in the same breath. In other words, those most recognized as the most masculine were both the cutthroat elites with economic and political dominance and the hard-nosed resistors who fought against them. Another accepted contradiction that shapes Midwestern history in powerful ways is how Midwesterners structured their families. Many families strayed far from patriarchal norms, religious dictates, or agrarian myths, constituting themselves instead out of so-called deviant behaviors. Midwestern kinship was complicated. As Tamara Gaskill Miller noted about early Ohio, household composition varied remarkably as people intermingled, divorced, remarried, or moved. Most Midwesterners tacitly understood this reality as they both created formal welfare structures and practiced informal neighborliness to assist vulnerable populations. For example, as Megan Burke explained about poor farms, public funds supported these ubiquitous county-level institutions without a test or labor requirement. In other words, necessity, not worthiness, was the standard by which communities supported their poorest residents. Burke also explains that poor farms most helped those without kinship or neighborly networks, housing largely non-able-bodied, single, and elderly white men by the early 20th century. Many Midwesterners prized a community-centered ethos, one that encouraged civic attention to initiatives that promised to uplift, provide care for, or aid people with or without families. So feminine tropes of hospitality, friendliness, partnership, cooperation, and mutuality also became synonymous with the Midwest. So as I consider the pathways my scholarship has taken, I am starting a research on the history of food in the Midwest. I'm very excited about this. I wonder if the Midwest feels lost because it isn't what we expect. It doesn't fit our boxes. It contradicts our assumptions. And when we try to capture it, this region, its communities, its peoples, its boundaries, its values, all of these things have shifted in that process into something else. I think this is exciting. The energy, the momentum, the possibilities, these elements are what make Midwestern history ascendant, challenging myths, embracing a boundaryless interiority, and discovering the connection between contradiction and tenacity is compelling not just to historians of the region, but to all historians. The future of history is Midwestern. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Questions for our panel? Nobody wants to be that brave soul that stands between us and dinner? Anyone? Okay. Well, I think we've worked hard today, and we've covered a lot of ground. It has been a slog. I want to thank you all for coming, and want to give special thanks to Kaylee again, but she's always out working on something, so she's never in here to hear it. But we want to give final thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for making this possible, for Middle West Review, for the University of South Dakota, for the Washington Pavilion, and want to tip you off that we hope to have something like this in the fall, again, a mini conference, maybe a day long. We'll see in coming months if that's possible. Also want to highlight, if this has piqued your interest, in May of this year, the Midwestern History Association Conference will take place in Oxford, Ohio. And I think the call for papers is out on that right now, and there's another month or so to get your proposals in. So please take that in. For all of those, for all of you who drove a long ways, thank you for doing that. Thank you for being part of this enterprise. And let's give final thanks to our panel.